Family road trips of the 60s and 70s were chaotic, seatbelt optional adventures that kids today could hardly imagine. With no GPS, no entertainment devices, and only a paper map to guide them, families simply packed the station wagon and hoped for the best. These unpredictable journeys, filled with questionable food, bizarre roadside stops, and plenty of sibling battles, were equal parts survival test and unforgettable adventure. So, let's take a nostalgic drive down memory lane and revisit what made those trips so uniquely wild. No seatbelts in the back seat. If you took a family road trip in the 1960s or early 1970s, there's a good chance you spent most of it rolling around in the back seat like a loose piece of luggage. Seatbelts weren't mandatory for rear passengers until much later, and even when cars had them, most parents didn't bother making their kids wear them. The back seat was basically a lawless zone where kids could lay down, play games, and tumble around every time Dad hit the brakes too hard. Some station wagons even had that coveted rear-facing third seat in the very back, where you could wave at the cars behind you while completely unrestrained. It wasn't uncommon for kids to stand up between the front seats to talk to their parents, or even climb into the front to sit on Mom's lap. The idea of everyone being properly buckled in just wasn't part of the culture yet. Safety regulations were minimal, and the attitude was pretty much that if you survived the trip, great. And if you got a little banged up along the way, well, that built character. Looking back, it's amazing that more serious injuries didn't occur. But somehow, most of us made it through relatively unscathed, even if we did get thrown around the car a few times when Dad had to slam on the brakes. The metal death traps, we called station wagons. The family station wagon was the vehicle of choice for road trips in the 60s and 70s. And while they had plenty of room, they were also basically giant metal death traps on wheels. These cars had no crumple zones, no airbags, and dashboards made of hard plastic or metal that could knock you out if you hit them. The steering column was a solid steel rod pointing right at the driver's chest, just waiting to impale them in a collision. Seatbelts were minimal at best, and the cars themselves were built like tanks, which sounds good until you realize that in an accident, all that force transfers directly to the passengers. But we loved these wagons because they were spacious and had that iconic wood paneling on the sides that screamed American family vacation. Kids would pile into the back, sometimes 6 or 7 deep, with luggage stacked so high you couldn't see out the rear window. The way back area behind the rear seat was the ultimate spot, where you could stretch out and nap or play games without anyone bothering you. Of course, in an accident, you'd become a human projectile, but nobody thought about that back then. These cars also had terrible gas mileage, no power steering, and brakes that required serious leg strength to actually stop the vehicle. They overheated constantly, especially climbing mountains in the summer heat, which meant frequent stops to let the engine cool down while steam poured out from under the hood. Gas station attendants who actually served you. One of the strangest things about road trips in the 60s and 70s was that you never pumped your own gas. Full-service gas stations were everywhere, and when you pulled up, an attendant in a uniform would come out to help you. They'd pump your gas, check your oil, clean your windshield, check your tire pressure, and even look under the hood if you asked. It was an actual service, not just someone standing there watching you pump your own gas. These attendants knew cars inside and out and could often spot problems before they became serious. They'd tell your dad that the fan belt looked worn, or that the oil was getting dark and needed changing. Gas stations were also social hubs where you could get directions, recommendations for restaurants, and information about road conditions ahead. The attendants usually knew the area well and could tell you which routes to avoid or where construction was happening. This level of service is completely foreign to kids today, who've only ever known self-service stations where you're lucky if the credit card reader works properly. Back then, you could pull in with a finicky engine, and the attendant might actually be able to fix it right there, or at least get you running well enough to make it to the next town. They'd also hand out maps for free, another amenity that's disappeared. The whole experience made road trips feel more manageable because you knew that every 50 miles or so, there'd be someone who could help if your car was acting up. Reading maps in the dark with a tiny flashlight. Navigation during 60s and 70s road trips was a family affair that usually involved shouting, frustration, and someone insisting they knew where they were going despite clear evidence to the contrary. Your navigation system was a paper map, usually from Borese or picked up free at a gas station. And reading these things was an art form. The maps were huge, unwieldy, and impossible to fold back correctly once you opened them. They'd crinkle and tear at the creases, and finding a specific small town often required a magnifying glass and good eyesight. At night, the job of navigating fell to whoever was in the passenger seat, usually Mom, who would use a tiny flashlight to try to read the map while Dad drove. This flashlight was never bright enough, and the batteries were always half dead, so you'd be squinting at this giant map in dim light while trying to figure out if you were supposed to turn at the next exit or 3 exits from now. Arguments about directions were a guaranteed part of every trip, with Dad insisting he knew the way and Mom pointing at the map, trying to explain that they'd missed the turn 5 miles back. Kids in the back seat would chime in with helpful suggestions that were completely ignored. There was no real-time traffic information, no ability to see accidents ahead, and no way to reroute on the fly. Once you committed to a route, you were pretty much stuck with it unless you wanted to pull over and have a family meeting about the map. The bizarre roadside attractions. We actually stopped for the 60s and 70s were the golden age of weird roadside attractions, and no family road trip was complete without stopping at least a few of them. These weren't carefully curated museums or educational experiences. These were bizarre, often homemade attractions that someone had built and decided to charge admission for. You had places like the world's largest ball of twine, a house made entirely of bottles, mystery spots where water supposedly flowed uphill, and reptile farms where you could see alligators in concrete pits. There were Indian trading posts, usually run by people who weren't actually Native American, selling turquoise jewelry and rubber tomahawks. Wall Drug in South Dakota advertised for hundreds of miles with signs promising free ice water, and families would actually make the detour just to see what all the fuss was about. Then there were the weird animal attractions like snake farms, ostrich ranches, and places where you could see a 2-headed calf preserved in formaldehyde. Dinosaur parks with crude concrete sculptures of prehistoric creatures dotted the highways, giving kids a chance to climb on a brontosaurus while Dad took pictures with his Polaroid. These attractions were usually pretty disappointing once you actually paid your 50 cents and went inside, but somehow that didn't matter. The experience of stopping at these places, seeing the hand-painted signs, and wondering what strange thing you'd encounter next was all part of the adventure. Kids today who are used to elaborate theme parks and virtual reality experiences could never appreciate the simple joy of pulling off the highway to see the world's largest rocking chair. No air conditioning meant creative solutions. Most family cars in the 60s and early 70s either didn't have air conditioning or had units that barely worked, which meant summer road trips were hot, sticky, and miserable affairs. The standard solution was to roll down all the windows and hope for a breeze. But when you're sitting in stop-and-go traffic or climbing a mountain at 20 miles per hour, that breeze didn't help much. The combination of hot vinyl seats, no air circulation, and the sun beating down through the windows turned the car into a mobile oven. Kids would stick their heads out the windows like dogs just to get some air, and everyone's hair would be whipping around wildly. Dad would usually be drenched in sweat, gripping the steering wheel with wet hands, while Mom fanned herself with the folded-up map. Some families tried creative solutions like hanging a wet towel over the rolled-down window, supposedly using evaporative cooling to bring the temperature down, though it's unclear if this actually worked or just made everything damp. The cars that did have air conditioning faced constant problems. The AC would work great until you got on the highway, then it would start blowing warm air. Or it would work fine until you had to go uphill. at which point Dad would turn it off because the engine was already struggling enough without the extra strain. The rear vent windows were a popular feature because you could angle them just right to direct airflow, though this often resulted in someone getting blasted with hot air while someone else got nothing. Stopping for ice cream or cold drinks at every possible opportunity wasn't just about treats, it was about survival. The mystery: meet at Howard Johnson's. Howard Johnson's restaurants were a staple of road trip dining in the 60s and 70s, with their orange roofs visible from miles away on the interstate. These restaurants were everywhere, and families would plan their stops around them, because at least you knew what to expect, even if what you expected wasn't always great. The menu was extensive, featuring the famous 28 flavors of ice cream, along with a full selection of American comfort food. But the quality of the food was questionable at best. The fried clams were supposedly a signature dish, but they often tasted like rubber. The burgers were thin and overcooked, the hot dogs were suspect, and the macaroni and cheese came in shades of orange that don't occur in nature. But kids didn't care because after hours in a hot car, anything seemed delicious. Plus, there was ice cream at the end. The restaurants all looked identical inside, with the same colonial-themed decor, the same orange and blue color scheme, and the same tired waitresses who'd seen it all. The booths were orange vinyl that stuck to your legs, and the tables always seemed slightly sticky. But Howard Johnson's was reliable, which counted for something when you were in an unfamiliar town and hungry. You knew you could get a meal there, even if it wasn't going to be particularly memorable. The restaurants also had clean bathrooms, which was a major selling point. Some families would only stop at Hojo's because they trusted the facilities, even if the food was mediocre. The ice cream selection was genuinely impressive, and letting kids pick from 28 flavors made the stop feel special. Smoking in the car with the windows up. If you took a road trip with parents who smoked in the 60s or 70s, you probably spent much of the journey in a fog of cigarette smoke so thick you could barely see out the windshield. It was completely normal for adults to chain smoke during long drives, often with the windows barely cracked for ventilation. The ashtrays in cars weren't just decorative, they were essential equipment that would fill up with butts and ash during a long trip. Some cars even had ashtrays in the back seat for passengers who smoked. The cigarette lighter was one of the most used features in the car, constantly being popped in and out to light another smoke. Kids would be in the back seat trying not to cough, while the front seat was clouded in smoke from mom and dad's simultaneous cigarettes. The smell would permeate everything: your clothes, your hair, the upholstery, and every piece of luggage. When you finally got to your destination and unpacked, everything reeked of stale cigarette smoke. If you complained about the smoke, you'd be told to stop whining, or the window would be cracked open another inch, letting in hot air but doing little to clear the smoke. Some parents would smoke with the air conditioning on and windows up, creating a sealed chamber of secondhand smoke that kids today would consider child abuse. But back then, nobody thought twice about it. Smoking was just what adults did, and if you were a kid stuck in the car, you just had to deal with it. The combination of cigarette smoke, car exhaust fumes, and the smell of hot vinyl created an olfactory experience that was uniquely unpleasant. Years later, many of us still associate road trips with that distinctive smell of stale smoke, mixed with the coconut scent of copper-tone sunscreen. The backseat fights were legendary. Put 3 or 4 kids in the back seat of a car for 8 hours with no electronic devices and minimal entertainment, and you're gonna get fights. These weren't minor disagreements, these were full-scale battles over everything from who was touching whom to who was looking at whom to who got to sit by the window. The invisible line drawn down the middle of the seat was sacred territory, and any perceived violation would result in immediate retaliation. Siblings would poke, pinch, and antagonize each other in increasingly creative ways, trying to make the other one cry or get them in trouble without getting caught themselves. The classic move was the "I'm not touching you" game, where you'd hold your finger an inch from your brother or sister's face, technically not making contact, but being as annoying as humanly possible. Another favorite was the territorial dispute over the middle seat armrest, if your car had one. Both kids would fight for control of this coveted real estate, shoving and pushing until someone's arm hurt or dad yelled from the front seat. Parents would try various tactics to maintain peace. Some would threaten to turn the car around and go home, though this threat was rarely carried out because everyone knew we'd already driven too far. Others would implement rules about taking turns by the window or dividing the back seat into zones that couldn't be violated. The ultimate punishment was the warning that if the fighting didn't stop, there would be no stopping for ice cream or swimming at the motel. When things got really bad, Dad would reach back with one hand while still driving, swinging blindly to swat at whoever was closest, which usually ended up being the innocent kid who was just sitting there minding their own business. Tourist trap souvenirs were mandatory. Every road trip required stopping at gift shops and coming away with souvenirs that proved you'd actually been somewhere. These weren't quality items or meaningful mementos. They were cheap trinkets mass-produced in factories and sold at wildly inflated prices to tourists who didn't know any better. The classic souvenirs included pennants with the state name and a picture of something vaguely related to the area, like a cactus for Arizona or a lobster for Maine. These felt pennants would hang on bedroom walls for years, fading in the sunlight and gathering dust. Then there were the miniature license plates with your name on them, assuming you had a common enough name to be in stock. If your name was Jennifer or Michael, you were golden, but if you had an unusual name, you'd have to settle for the closest alternative or buy a blank one. Snow globes were popular regardless of whether there was actually snow in the location you were visiting. You could get a snow globe of the Grand Canyon, which made no logical sense, but kids didn't care because shaking it and watching the glitter swirl around was entertaining. Postcards were mandatory purchases, usually of whatever attraction you just visited, though these would often sit in a drawer for months before anyone actually mailed them, if they ever got mailed at all. Shot glasses with state names and tourist destinations were everywhere, even though kids couldn't use them, and most adults didn't really want a collection of mismatched shot glasses cluttering their cabinets. But you bought them anyway because that's what you did on vacation. There were also the truly weird souvenirs like jackalopes, those fake-mounted rabbit heads with antlers, or rubber snakes and scorpions that seemed scary at the gift shop, but looked ridiculous once you got home. Rest stop bathrooms were pure horror. Rest stop bathrooms in the 60s and 70s were nightmarish facilities that made you question whether you really needed to go that badly. These weren't the relatively clean, well-maintained rest areas we have today. These were concrete block buildings with minimal lighting, mysterious puddles on the floor, and smells that would knock you over when you opened the door. The toilets often didn't flush properly, or didn't have seats at all, just a cold porcelain rim that nobody wanted to touch. Toilet paper was either missing entirely, or was that horrible waxed paper that didn't actually absorb anything and felt like you were wiping with notebook paper. The sinks usually had only cold water, assuming the faucets worked at all, and soap was a luxury you couldn't count on. Hand dryers were either broken or so weak they could run for 5 minutes, and your hands would still be wet. Paper towels were a rarity, so most people just wiped their hands on their pants. The floors were always wet, though you couldn't be sure if it was from leaking pipes, overflowing toilets, or something worse you didn't want to think about. Mom would make you hover over the toilet seat rather than actually sitting down, a skill that required significant thigh strength to maintain for any length of time. The bathrooms were often separated from the parking area by a dark walkway, which was especially creepy at night when the lighting was poor and strange insects swarmed around the few lights that worked. Many rest stops also had vending machines that sold the worst possible snacks and drinks, all of which were overpriced and often past their expiration dates. The machines frequently ate your quarters without dispensing anything, and there was never anyone around to complain to. The cooler, full of warm sandwiches. To save money on road trips, most families packed a cooler full of sandwiches, drinks, and snacks that would supposedly last the whole trip. The cooler itself was usually a simple styrofoam model or a metal Coleman that was supposed to keep things cold, but rarely did an adequate job, especially after sitting in the hot car all morning. The ice would melt within a few hours, turning into lukewarm water that sloshed around and soaked the sandwiches through their plastic wrap or wax paper. By lunchtime, you'd open the cooler to find soggy bread, warm bologna, and drinks floating in water that was barely cooler than room temperature. The sandwiches were usually basic combinations like bologna and cheese, peanut butter and jelly, or if you were lucky, ham and cheese, all made the night before, and sitting in that cooler getting progressively less appetizing. The cheese would get slimy, the lettuce would wilt, and the mayonnaise would reach that temperature where you started worrying about food poisoning. But you ate them anyway because stopping at restaurants for every meal was expensive, and Dad had already made it clear that we were eating what we packed. The drinks in the cooler were usually off-brand sodas or Kool-Aid in a plastic jug that would leak and mix with the melted ice water, creating a weird diluted punch that nobody wanted. There would also be apples or other fruit that would get bruised from being jostled around in the cooler, and cookies or chips that would get crushed under the weight of everything else. Pulling over at a rest area or scenic overlook to eat these warm, soggy sandwiches while sitting at a picnic table covered in bird droppings was considered a perfectly acceptable meal, and you'd better not complain about it. Playing license plate bingo for hours. With no DVD players, tablets, or smartphones to keep them occupied, kids on road trips had to create their own entertainment, and one of the most popular games was license plate bingo. The goal was to spot license plates from as many different states as possible, keeping track on a printed card or just on paper. Seeing a plate from a nearby state was easy and earned no particular acclaim, but spotting one from Hawaii or Alaska was like winning the lottery and gave you bragging rights for the rest of the trip. Kids would spend hours staring out the window, scanning every car that passed for plates they hadn't seen yet. The competition between siblings could get intense, with arguments over who saw the plate first and whether it counted if the car was parked versus driving. Some families made it a cooperative effort, working together to spot all 50 states, though this was nearly impossible unless you were driving across most of the country. Even getting to 30 or 40 states felt like a major accomplishment. The game required patience and attention, two things that kids didn't usually have in abundance. But somehow license plate bingo kept them occupied for longer than you'd think. It also taught geography in a way that was more engaging than any textbook, as kids learned where different states were located and what their plates looked like. Some plates were easy to identify, like Texas with its outline of the state, or Florida with its orange, but others were more generic and required closer inspection. The game would occasionally lead to discoveries like unusual vanity plates that kids found hilarious, even if they didn't fully understand what they meant. There were also other variations like counting specific types of vehicles, looking for out-of-state plates on trucks, or trying to see every make and model of car. None of these games would entertain a modern kid for more than 5 minutes, but back then, they were how you survived the long drive. Motels were sketchy and we didn't care. Family motels in the 60s and 70s were nothing like the polished chain hotels we're used to today. These were independent spots with names like the Sleepy Hollow Motor Inn or the Desert Oasis Lodge, and their quality ranged from perfectly fine to deeply questionable. You'd pull into a parking lot beneath a flickering neon sign, while Dad went inside to get a room, and the rest of the family waited in the car, silently assessing whether the place looked safe enough for one night. The office usually had dark wood paneling, shag carpet, a display of faded postcards, and a clerk who seemed to have lived several lifetimes. The smell, always a mix of cigarettes, pine cleaner, and mildew, hit you instantly. The rooms were basic. 2 double beds with thin, scratchy bedspreads you tried not to study too closely, a small TV that got maybe 3 channels, and a bathroom with unpredictable water pressure and stains that raised questions. The window air conditioner was thunderously loud and had only 2 modes, off or freezing. The beds were lumpy, the pillows flat, and the mattresses full of springs. You definitely felt, but after hours on the road, exhaustion made everything tolerable. For kids, the pool was the real treasure. Whether it was kidney-shaped, slightly green, or filled with floating leaves, it meant freedom after a long day trapped in the car, while parents relaxed in plastic chairs, grateful for a moment of peace. No GPS meant getting hopelessly lost. Getting lost was practically a guaranteed part of any road trip in the 60s and 70s because there was no GPS to guide you back on track. Once you made a wrong turn or missed an exit, you were on your own to figure out where you went wrong and how to get back on course. This usually involved pulling over at a gas station to ask for directions, and the quality of those directions varied wildly. Some people would give you perfect turn-by-turn instructions that got you right back on the highway. Others would wave their hands vaguely and say things like, "Head down that way for a spell and then turn when you see the old barn," which wasn't helpful when you had no idea what barn they were talking about, or how long a spell was supposed to be. Dad usually insisted he knew where he was going, even when it was obvious we were lost, driving in circles while getting increasingly frustrated. Mom would try to help with the map, but Dad often didn't want to hear it, certain that he'd recognize something soon and get us back on track. Meanwhile, the kids in the back seat would point out that we'd passed the same gas station twice, which didn't improve Dad's mood. Some families would drive for 30 minutes in the wrong direction before finally admitting they were lost and turning around. In rural areas, getting lost could mean driving through small towns that looked frozen in time, where you'd get stares from locals who weren't used to seeing out-of-state plates. Sometimes you'd end up on dirt roads or routes that were clearly not meant for a fully loaded station wagon, bouncing over potholes and hoping you didn't break an axle. The lack of GPS also meant you couldn't see what was ahead, so there was no warning about traffic jams, closed roads, or construction detours. You just drove and hoped for the best, and if you hit a problem, you dealt with it when it happened. The car sickness was real. Car sickness was a common affliction on long road trips, and it could turn a fun journey into a miserable experience for everyone involved. Some kids were more prone to it than others, and usually it would strike at the worst possible times, like when you were on a winding mountain road with nowhere to pull over. The warning signs were always the same. First you'd get quiet, then you'd start looking pale, then you'd announce you didn't feel good. If you were lucky, Dad could pull over in time. If you weren't lucky, well, that's what plastic bags were for. The motion of the car combined with the smell of cigarette smoke, warm food from the cooler, and the heat would create the perfect storm for nausea. Reading in the car was a guaranteed way to trigger car sickness, though many kids didn't realize this until they had already started feeling queasy while trying to read a comic book. The back area of the station wagon was especially bad for car sickness because you were facing backward and couldn't see the road ahead. Some families swore by remedies like ginger ale or saltine crackers, while others would open windows for fresh air, which sometimes helped, and sometimes just made it worse by bringing in exhaust fumes. There were also those strange motion sickness bands you could wear on your wrist that were supposed to use pressure points to prevent nausea, though it's unclear if they actually worked or were just a placebo. The threat of car sickness hung over every trip like a dark cloud, and parents would often forbid the susceptible child from eating too much before getting in the car or drinking too much soda. Once someone got car sick, the smell would linger in the car for the rest of the trip, making everyone else slightly nauseous too. AM radio. Was your only entertainment on 60s and early 70s road trips was limited to whatever AM radio could deliver, which often wasn't much. Many cars didn't even have FM yet, so your soundtrack was a rotating mix of scratchy talk radio, twangy country music, or whatever faint local signal you could catch as you drifted in and out of range. Dad would spend long stretches twisting the dial, trying to land on something listenable while the speakers crackled, hissed, and occasionally exploded with a burst of a preacher, a farm report, or a weather warning from 3 counties over. When you finally found a station playing rock and roll or a pop hit, You clung to it until the signal faded into static and you had to start the search all over again. The randomness of AM radio meant you sometimes stumbled on strange sermons, regional oddities, or songs you'd never normally hear, yet somehow remembered forever. Commercials were constant too, pitching local diners, car lots, and motels you'd never visit but could picture perfectly thanks to their enthusiastic jingles. Some families tried following baseball games, only for the broadcast to vanish right as the base is loaded. Meanwhile, kids begged to change the station when Dad settled on talk radio, but Dad insisted it was important, usually just someone ranting about politics or explaining carburetors for an hour, stopping at every single historical marker. If your dad was even slightly interested in history, road trips meant stopping at every historical marker along the highway, much to the annoyance of everyone else in the car. These brown signs would announce some event or person of historical significance, and Dad would pull over, get out, and read every single word on the plaque, while the rest of the family sat in the car, wondering why this was necessary. The markers commemorated everything from important battles to famous people born in the area to industries that used to exist there. Some were genuinely interesting, describing significant events that shaped American history. Others were incredibly boring, like, on this spot in 1873, a man named Cornelius established a trading post that operated until 1876. But Dad didn't discriminate. He wanted to read them all. Kids would groan when they saw the brown historical marker sign approaching, knowing that meant another unplanned stop was coming. You'd already been in the car for hours, you were hot and bored, and now you had to sit there while Dad educated himself about something that happened 100 years ago. Sometimes he'd even take pictures of the marker, using up precious frames on his film camera that could have been used for actual vacation photos. Mom would try to hurry him along, reminding him that we had a schedule to keep. But Dad would take his time, occasionally calling out interesting facts to the car that nobody was listening to. These stops were particularly frustrating when they happened right after you just stopped for gas or food, meaning you could have read the marker then, instead of stopping again. But for Dad, these markers were part of what made the trip educational and worthwhile, even if nobody else in the car shared his enthusiasm for roadside history lessons. The vinyl seats that burned your legs. Vinyl car seats in the 60s and 70s were standard in most vehicles, and anyone who sat on one in the summer remembers them as instruments of pure torture. After even an hour in the sun, those seats could heat to blistering temperatures that practically branded the backs of your legs. Getting into a sun-baked car became a ritual, opening all the doors to release the trapped heat, testing the seat with a cautious tap of your hand, and then attempting a delicate half-sit to avoid full contact with the scorching vinyl. Kids wearing shorts stuck to the seats instantly, and peeling yourself off at the end of the ride felt like removing a layer of skin. Some families tried covering the seats with towels, but they slid off within minutes and ended up in a crumpled heap on the floor. Others simply accepted that burned thighs were a part of summer. In winter, the vinyl became the opposite kind of misery, freezing cold and stiff, like sitting on a block of ice. Over time, the material would crack or split, leaving sharp edges that scratched legs and snagged clothing. And then there was the smell, a potent blend of warm vinyl, old fries, spilled soda, and something vaguely plastic that filled every car with an aroma equal parts unpleasant and nostalgic. "Are we there yet?" was asked every 5 minutes. The eternal question of every family road trip in the 60s and 70s was, "Are we there yet?" And it would be asked approximately 400 times during an 8-hour drive. Kids had no concept of time or distance, so 5 minutes after leaving the house, they'd start asking when you'd arrive. Parents would try various tactics to answer this question in ways that would satisfy kids and buy themselves some peace. Some would give time estimates. "We'll be there in 4 hours," which meant nothing to a 6-year-old who didn't really understand what 4 hours felt like. Others would try landmarks. "We'll be there after we see the mountains," which worked until the mountains appeared. And then the question became, are those the mountains? The most optimistic parents would try to make it a game, having kids watch for specific signs or count certain types of vehicles, anything to distract from the monotony of the drive. But inevitably, every 30 minutes or so, the question would resurface. Are we there yet? How much longer? When are we going to get there? These questions would increase in frequency as the trip went on, reaching a crescendo in the final hour when kids were tired, bored, and completely done with being in the car. Parents' answers would become increasingly terse, going from patient explanations to single-word responses to finally just no, without even looking back. Some kids would try to sleep through parts of the trip to make it go faster, but car sleep was never very comfortable, especially when you woke up with your face pressed against the window and drool on your chin. The question would also come up during bathroom stops, meal breaks, and gas station visits, as if somehow the destination might have moved closer while you weren't driving. When you finally did arrive, after hours of asking, "Are we there yet?" the relief was palpable for everyone involved. Family road trips in the 60s and 70s were equal parts chaos and charm. With no modern safety features, no gadgets, and hours of boredom, we survived on paper maps, warm sandwiches, and blind optimism. Getting lost, bickering with siblings, and stopping at questionable rest areas somehow became the stories we cherish most. Today's trips may be smoother, with GPS, air conditioning, and endless entertainment, but they've lost a bit of that wild unpredictability. Those old journeys taught patience, creativity, and resilience. What strange roadside memories do you have from those days? Share your stories and keep the nostalgia rolling.